I'm Sarah, 28 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal looked like until I walked into my childhood home after my mother's 60th birthday party to find everything I owned stuffed into garbage bags on the front lawn. But the real shock wasn't the bags themselves. It was seeing my mother standing in the doorway with that cold, satisfied smirk on her face, like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. What happened next didn't just change our relationship forever. It revealed a truth about my family that I'd been blind to for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the eldest daughter in the Chen household meant carrying expectations that felt heavier than concrete blocks. My mother, Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in her 20s with nothing but a suitcase and dreams of American success. She built her life from scratch, working double shifts at a textile factory while attending night school to become a certified public accountant. By the time I was born, she had transformed herself into a woman who measured worth in achievements, bank statements, and social status within our tight-knit community. Our house on Maple Street was modest, but immaculate. Every surface polished to perfection, every family photo strategically placed to tell the story of our success. Mom had a way of making even casual conversations feel like performance reviews. She'd scrutinize my report cards like they were tax returns, dissect my friendship choices like they were business partnerships, and evaluate my career moves like they determined the family's entire reputation. My father, David, was quieter but no less demanding. He owned a small import business that kept him traveling frequently, leaving Mom to run the household with military precision. When he was home, he'd sit at the dinner table reviewing my academic progress and future plans with the same intensity he brought to his quarterly profit reports. Neither of my parents understood the concept of unconditional love. In our house, affection was earned through accomplishment, and disappointment was a form of personal betrayal. My younger brother Marcus, 5 years my junior, seemed to glide through childhood untouched by these pressures. Maybe it was because he was the boy, the one who would carry the family name, or maybe because I had absorbed so much of their intensity that there was little left for him. While I struggled under the weight of being the perfect daughter, Marcus played video games, got average grades, and somehow still earned more genuine smiles from our parents than I had in my entire life. The pattern established itself early and remained consistent throughout my childhood. When I brought home a 95 on a math test, Mom would ask about the 5 points I'd lost. When I made the honor roll, she'd wonder why I wasn't valedictorian. When I got into state university with a partial scholarship, she spent the celebration dinner calculating how much money we'd still need to pay and suggesting I should have tried harder for a full ride. College became my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without constantly measuring my worth against impossible standards. I studied communications and discovered a passion for storytelling that felt completely separate from my family's definition of success. For 4 years, I lived in dorms and shared apartments, coming home only for holidays and brief summer visits that grew shorter each year as I found internships and summer jobs that kept me away. After graduation, I moved to Chicago and found work at a mid-sized marketing agency. The pay was decent, the work was engaging, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something that belonged entirely to me. I rented a studio apartment in a converted warehouse, nothing fancy but filled with books, plants, and furniture I'd chosen myself. My life felt authentic in a way it never had while living under my parents' roof. The phone, calls home became routine check-ins, surface-level conversations about work and weather that carefully avoided deeper topics. Mom would update me on neighborhood gossip and Marcus's latest achievements. He'd started working at Dad's import business and apparently showed real promise in sales. I'd share carefully edited highlights of my life, omitting the struggles with freelance projects, the tight budgets, and the relationships that hadn't worked out. 3 years into my Chicago life, I met James through a mutual friend at a coffee shop near my office. He was a graphic designer with an easy laugh and a way of seeing beauty in everyday moments that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with storytelling in the first place. Our relationship developed slowly, built on long conversations about art and dreams and the kind of future we wanted to create together. When I finally brought James home for Christmas that year, I watched my parents evaluate him like they were conducting a job interview. Mom asked pointed questions about his career prospects and family background, while Dad inquired about his 5-year plan and investment strategies. James handled their interrogation with grace, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He came from a family where love was freely given, where worth wasn't measured in achievements. After that visit, Mom began making subtle comments about my choices. She'd mention other daughters in the community who had married doctors or lawyers, who owned houses instead of renting apartments, who had given their parents grandchildren. The pressure felt familiar but more urgent now, as if my approaching 30s represented some kind of deadline I was racing toward. The first real crack in our relationship appeared when I decided to leave the marketing agency to start my own freelance consulting business. I'd saved enough money to survive for 6 months while building a client base, and I had several potential contracts lined up. To me, it felt like the natural next step in building the independent life I'd always wanted. To my parents, it looked like professional suicide. The phone call when I shared the news lasted 2 hours and left me emotionally drained. Mom couldn't understand why I would give up a stable job with benefits to chase what she called artistic fantasies. Dad worried about my financial security and questioned whether I'd really thought through the business implications. They both suggested I was being irresponsible, throwing away everything I'd worked for on a whim. Marcus, who had never taken a risk in his life, was held up as the model of good decision-making. He'd just gotten engaged to his college girlfriend, bought a house in our hometown, and settled into what our parents considered a sensible, stable life. The comparisons were constant and painful, each one designed to highlight how far I'd strayed from their vision of success. Despite their disapproval, my consulting business thrived. Within 6 months, I had more work than I could handle, and by the end of the first year, I was earning more than I had at the agency. James and I moved in together, splitting time between his apartment and mine before eventually finding a place that felt like ours. Life in Chicago became everything I'd hoped it would be: creative, independent, and completely my own. But success didn't soften my parents' criticism. If anything, it seemed to intensify their need to find flaws in my choices. When James and I got engaged after 3 years together, Mom's first question wasn't about our happiness, but about our wedding timeline and whether we planned to move back to Ohio. When I explained that we loved Chicago and had built our careers there, she spent the next hour listing all the reasons why raising children away from family was selfish and short-sighted. The wedding planning process became a battlefield of competing visions. Mom wanted a traditional Chinese-American celebration with 300 guests, elaborate decorations, and a banquet menu that would impress the entire community. James and I preferred something smaller and more intimate, a orchestra.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Celebration that reflected our actual relationship rather than our family's social expectations. Every decision became a negotiation. Every compromise felt like a betrayal of someone's vision. Mom took my preference for simplicity as a personal rejection, as if choosing a smaller venue was somehow an insult to her dreams for my future. She'd make comments about how other mothers got to be proud of their daughters, weddings, how she'd hoped to finally have something to show off to her friends. The tension reached a breaking point 3 months before the wedding when I decided to elope instead. James and I flew to Portland, got married at a small ceremony overlooking the Columbia River, and spent our honeymoon exploring the Pacific Northwest. We called our families afterward, sharing photos and explaining that we'd wanted something private and meaningful rather than stressful and performative. Mom didn't speak to me for 6 weeks. When we finally reconciled, the dynamic between us had shifted permanently. She was cordial but distant, treating me more like an acquaintance than a daughter. Our conversations became even more superficial, focused on safe topics that couldn't lead to conflict. I could feel her disappointment radiating through every interaction, a constant reminder that I'd failed to be the daughter she'd hoped for. James and I settled into married life with a mixture of relief and sadness. We were happy together, building the kind of partnership we'd both wanted, but the rift with my family cast a shadow over our joy. I found myself making excuses for their behavior, explaining to James that they just showed love differently, that their criticism came from a place of caring rather than cruelty. 2 years into our marriage, James got offered a position at a design firm in San Francisco. The opportunity was too good to pass up: better pay, more creative freedom, and a chance to work on projects that aligned with his values. We decided to make the move, selling our Chicago apartment and starting fresh on the West Coast. My parents' reaction to our relocation was predictably negative. Mom saw it as another example of my selfishness, another way I was putting my own desires ahead of family obligations. Dad worried about how far we'd be from home, how difficult it would be to visit, how our children would grow up not knowing their grandparents. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being criticized for moving away from parents who had spent years making it clear that nothing I did was good enough for them. But pointing out this contradiction only led to more arguments, more accusations that I was being ungrateful and disrespectful. San Francisco became our refuge, a place where we could build relationships based on mutual respect, rather than conditional approval. My consulting business adapted easily to the new market, and James thrived in his new role. We made friends who celebrated our successes without comparing them to their own achievements, who offered support during difficult times without keeping score of favors owed. The phone calls home became monthly obligations rather than sources of connection. Mom would update me on community news and Marcus's accomplishments. He and his wife had bought a bigger house, started talking about children, taken over more responsibilities in Dad's business. I'd share carefully curated updates about our life, avoiding topics that might trigger criticism or comparison. As my 30th birthday approached, I found myself reflecting on how different my life had become from what my parents had envisioned. I was successful by most measures, financially stable, professionally fulfilled, happily married, but none of it seemed to matter to them because it hadn't happened according to their timeline or their specifications. The distance between us felt both geographical and emotional, a chasm that had been widening for years and now seemed impossible to bridge. I'd accepted that we would never have the close, supportive relationship I'd once hoped for, but I still believed that family meant something, that blood ties created obligations that couldn't be completely severed. That belief would be tested in ways I never could have imagined. When Mom's 60th birthday approached, Marcus called to coordinate family plans. He suggested a surprise party, something elaborate enough to show our appreciation for everything she'd done for us. Despite our complicated relationship, I agreed to help plan the celebration. Whatever our differences, she was still my mother, and milestone birthdays felt like opportunities to set aside past grievances and focus on gratitude. James and I decided to fly back to Ohio for the weekend, our first visit home in almost 2 years. I spent weeks choosing the perfect gift, a collection of vintage books about Taiwan's history that I'd tracked down through rare book dealers, something that honored her heritage while acknowledging her love of reading. The books were expensive, but they felt meaningful in a way that jewelry or clothes wouldn't have been. The party planning brought out the best in our family's organizational skills. Marcus handled the venue and catering, Dad managed the guest list and invitations, and I coordinated with Mom's friends to ensure the surprise would actually be surprising. For a few weeks we functioned like the close-knit family I'd always wished we could be, working together toward a common goal without criticism or competition. I even found myself getting excited about the celebration, imagining Mom's face when she walked into the restaurant and saw all her friends and family gathered to honor her. Maybe this could be a turning point, a chance to rebuild our relationship on more positive ground. Maybe reaching 60 would give her perspective on what really mattered, help her see that having a daughter who was happy and independent was something to celebrate rather than resent. The party itself exceeded our expectations. Mom was genuinely surprised and clearly touched by the effort we'd put into the celebration. She gave a speech thanking everyone for coming, talking about how grateful she was for her family and friends, how blessed she felt to have reached this milestone surrounded by people she loved. For a moment, looking at her tear-filled eyes and genuine smile, I thought maybe we'd turned a corner. After the restaurant celebration, we all returned to the family house for drinks and more intimate conversation. Mom seemed relaxed and happy, showing off the gifts she'd received and laughing at stories her friends shared about their shared memories. James and I sat on the familiar couch in the living room, watching her hold court with a warmth I hadn't seen from her in years. Around midnight, as the last guests were leaving, Mom pulled me aside for a private conversation. She thanked me for the books, acknowledging that I'd put real thought into choosing something meaningful rather than just expensive. For a moment, her guard was down, and I caught a glimpse of the mother I'd once hoped she could be, proud, loving, accepting. We talked for almost an hour about her childhood in Taiwan, the stories behind some of the books I'd given her, the courage it had taken to start over in a new country. She even asked about my work, showing genuine interest in the projects I was handling and the clients I'd been working with. It felt like the kind of conversation I'd been craving for years, honest and connected without the usual undercurrent of disappointment. When James and I finally headed back to our hotel around 2 in the morning, I felt more optimistic about our relationship than I had in years. Maybe it was possible to bridge the gap that had grown between us. Maybe understanding could replace judgment, acceptance could replace criticism. Maybe it wasn't too late to become the family I'd always wanted us to be. The next morning, we planned to stop by the house to say goodbye before our afternoon flight back to San Francisco. I wanted to check on Mom, make sure she wasn't too tired from the party, maybe continue the conversation we'd started the night before. James suggested bringing coffee and pastries from her favorite bakery, a small gesture to extend the positive energy from the celebration. We arrived at the house around 10 in the morning, arms full of bakery bags and coffee cups, looking forward to a relaxed farewell breakfast. The front yard looked normal from the street, the same carefully maintained lawn, the same flower beds Mom tended with obsessive precision, the same welcome mat that had graced the front step for 15 years. But as we walked up the driveway, I noticed something strange near the garage. What looked like black plastic bags were scattered across the side yard, as if someone had left trash out on the wrong day. It wasn't until we got closer that I realized what I was looking at, and the coffee cups slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, crashing onto the concrete and sending hot liquids spreading across the driveway. Those weren't random trash bags. They were filled with my belongings. Clothes, books, photo albums, keepsakes I'd left in my childhood bedroom during the move to San Francisco. Everything I'd accumulated over 30 years of life, everything that connected me to my past, stuffed into garbage bags like refuse waiting for pickup. I stood frozen in the driveway, trying to process what I was seeing while James moved toward the bags with growing alarm. He opened one and pulled out my high school yearbook, its pages bent and water-damaged from condensation inside the plastic. Another bag contained my college textbooks, their spines cracked and covers warped. A third held photo albums documenting my childhood, memories that couldn't be replaced, now carelessly jumbled together with old clothes and random keepsakes. The front door opened, and my mother appeared on the threshold. But this wasn't the warm, grateful woman from the night before. This was someone I barely recognized. Cold, calculated, wearing an expression of satisfaction that made my blood freeze. She'd been waiting for us, waiting for this moment, savoring the anticipation of our discovery. She looked at me standing among the scattered bags of my belongings, and her mouth curved into a smirk that contained more cruelty than I'd ever imagined her capable of. It was the expression of someone who had planned this moment carefully, who had been looking forward to watching my reaction, who found genuine pleasure in my shock and pain. "Good morning, Sarah," she said, her voice artificially bright. "I hope you don't mind, but I decided to do some spring cleaning after the party. I figured it was time to clear out that bedroom. After all, you don't live here anymore." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable designed to inflict maximum damage. James stepped closer to me, his hand finding my elbow as if he sensed I might collapse. The coffee stains on the driveway spread between us and my mother, a dark boundary marking the moment everything changed forever. "Spring cleaning?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "These are my things, Mom. My personal belongings." She shrugged with theatrical indifference, adjusting the belt on her silk robe, as if we were discussing the weather. "They've been sitting in that room for 2 years collecting dust. I decided it was time to reclaim the space for something more useful." I walked toward one of the bags, my legs feeling disconnected from my body. Inside, I could see the corner of my childhood diary, its pink leather cover now scuffed and torn. Next to it was the ceramic elephant I'd made in 4th grade art class, the one she'd once displayed proudly on the mantelpiece. Now it lay broken in 3 pieces, its trunk separated from its body, chips of painted ceramics scattered among my old sweaters. "You threw away my art projects," I said, lifting the broken elephant with trembling hands. "The ones you used to say you were proud of." "I kept them for 20 years, she replied, her tone suggesting this was somehow generous. That's longer than most parents would bother. James knelt beside another bag, carefully extracting what looked like a photo album. When he opened it, loose pictures scattered onto the driveway. My first day of kindergarten, my high school graduation, family. Vacations from when Marcus and I were small. The plastic sleeves had been torn, and many of the photos were bent or water-stained. "Mrs. Chen," James said, his voice carefully controlled. "Some of these things can't be replaced. These family photos, Sarah's childhood memorabilia. Sarah made her choices." Mom interrupted, her eyes never leaving my face. "She chose to move across the country. She chose to build a life that doesn't include us. So I'm choosing to reclaim my house." The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This wasn't anger or disappointment. This was calculated revenge, planned and executed with surgical precision. She'd waited until after her birthday party, after I'd given her the expensive books, after we'd shared what I thought was a genuine moment of connection. She'd let me believe we were healing, then delivered this devastating blow when I was most vulnerable. "You could have called," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "You could have asked me to come get my things or ship them to me. You didn't have to throw them away like garbage." "Why would I spend money shipping things you obviously don't want?" she asked. "If they were important to you, you would have taken them when you moved away. The fact that you left them here for 2 years tells me everything I need to know about how much they actually mean to you." Her logic was twisted, but delivered with such conviction that for a moment I almost believed her. Almost accepted that this was somehow my fault, that by building an independent life I'd forfeited the right to my own history. The old patterns of self-doubt rose up automatically. The familiar voice that whispered maybe she was right, maybe I deserved this. But then James touched my shoulder, grounding me in the present moment, and I remembered who I'd become in the years since leaving home. I wasn't the uncertain teenager who'd once internalized every criticism. I was a successful adult with a loving marriage and a clear sense of my own worth. I didn't deserve this treatment, no matter what choices I'd made. "These weren't abandoned," I said, my voice growing stronger. "This was my childhood bedroom. I left these things here because this was supposed to be my family home, a place I could always come back to. I trusted you to respect my belongings." "Trust," she repeated, as if the word tasted bitter in her mouth. "You want to talk about trust. How about trusting me enough to involve me in your wedding plans? How about trusting me enough to ask my opinion before moving to California? How about trusting me enough to visit more than once every 2 years?" The accusations poured out of her like poison that had been building up for decades. Every resentment, every perceived slight, every moment of disappointment she'd stored up was now being weaponized against me. I realized this wasn't really about my belongings at all. It was about punishment, about making me pay for every choice I'd made that she didn't approve of. "I didn't involve you in my wedding because every conversation about it became a fight," I said. "I didn't ask your opinion about moving because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it. And I don't visit more often because every time I come home, I leave feeling worse about myself than when I arrived." Her smirk widened, as if my honesty had given her exactly the opening she'd been waiting for. "So this is my fault. I'm the terrible mother who drove you away?" Poor Sarah, so misunderstood by her demanding family. "I never said you were terrible," I replied, though my voice was shaking now. "I said you were demanding. I said you made me feel like nothing I did was ever good enough. But I kept trying anyway because you're my mother and I thought that meant something." "It means you have obligations," she snapped, her composure finally cracking. "It means you don't get to disappear across the country and pretend your family doesn't exist. It means you don't get to show up twice a year for surface-level visits and expect us to keep your room like a shrine." Behind her, I saw movement in the kitchen window. "Dad" appeared briefly, looking out at the scene unfolding in the driveway, then quickly disappeared again. The message was clear. He knew what was happening and had chosen not to intervene. This wasn't Mom acting alone in a moment of rage. This was a family decision, a united front against the daughter who dared to build a life on her own terms. James had been quietly gathering scattered photos while we argued, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. Many of them were beyond saving, but he carefully collected the ones that might be salvageable. His methodical approach to preserving what he could felt like a lifeline in the chaos of accusations and cruelty. "Where's Marcus?" I asked suddenly, realizing my brother was conspicuously absent from this confrontation. "Marcus has more important things to worry about than your drama," Mom said. "He and Linda are expecting their first child. They're focused on building a real life, not nursing old grievances." The news hit me like another blow. Marcus was going to be a father, and I was finding out in the worst possible way, delivered as ammunition in a fight rather than shared as family joy. The baby would be my first niece or nephew, and already I was being positioned as the estranged aunt who lived too far away to matter. "When is the baby due?" I asked, hating myself for caring but unable to stop myself from asking. "October," she said, her voice softening slightly as she spoke about the expected grandchild. "They've been trying for 2 years. Marcus wanted to tell you himself, but he's been busy preparing the nursery and helping Linda with her morning sickness." The contrast in her tone when talking about Marcus's life versus mine was devastating. His achievements were celebrated, his struggles met with sympathy and support. My successes were minimized, my challenges dismissed as self-inflicted drama. The double standard had always existed, but it had never been quite so nakedly displayed. "I would have liked to know about the baby," I said quietly. "I would have sent a gift, maybe planned a visit to meet my niece or nephew." "Would you?" she challenged. "Or would you have sent something expensive from California and considered your obligation fulfilled? Like you did with my birthday books. Beautiful gesture, but it doesn't make up for years of absence." The birthday books I'd spent weeks finding, the rare volumes about Taiwan's history that I'd thought would show how much I valued her heritage. She was throwing them back in my face as evidence of my superficiality. Everything I'd done to try to bridge the gap between us was being reinterpreted as proof of my inadequacy. I realized then that there was no winning this argument, because it wasn't really an argument at all. It was a trial where the verdict had been decided before the evidence was presented. I was guilty of being the daughter who'd chosen independence over compliance, and no amount of explanation or defense would change her mind. James stood up from where he'd been crouched by the bags, several rescued photos clutched in his hands. "Sarah," he said gently, "we should go. Our flight leaves in a few hours." He was right, of course. Standing in this driveway, arguing with my mother while my childhood memories lay scattered in garbage bags, wasn't accomplishing anything except causing more pain. But walking away felt like surrendering, like accepting her version of events where I was the selfish daughter who deserved this treatment. "I'll arrange for someone to pick up the bags," I said, trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. "I'll pay for storage until I can figure out what to do with everything." "Don't bother," Mom said. "Trash pickup is tomorrow morning. After that, it's the city's problem." The finality in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just about clearing out a bedroom. It was about erasing me from the family narrative. The physical destruction of my belongings was symbolic of something much larger, a complete severing of the ties that had once bound us together. I looked up at the house where I'd spent the first 18 years of my life, searching for some sign of the father who had raised me, the brother who had shared this childhood home. But the windows remained empty, the front door closed. They were inside, probably listening to every word. But they'd chosen to let Mom handle this confrontation alone. The abandonment cut deeper than her cruelty. I could understand, if not forgive, her anger and disappointment. But Dad's silence and Marcus's absence felt like betrayals of a different kind. They were allowing this to happen, watching her destroy what remained of our family relationships without lifting a finger to intervene. James gently took my arm, guiding me toward our rental car. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get out of here." I let him lead me away from the scattered bags, away from my mother's satisfied smirk, away from the house that no longer felt like home. As we reached the car, I turned back for one last look at the scene. Mom was still standing in the doorway, watching our retreat with undisguised satisfaction. "Sarah," she called out as I opened the car door. "Next time you decide to visit, call first. I'd hate for you to make another wasted trip." The casual cruelty of her parting shot was perfectly calibrated to inflict maximum damage. She wasn't just destroying my belongings, she was making it clear that I was no longer welcome in the place where I'd grown up. The message was unmistakable. I had chosen my independence, and now I would live with the consequences. James started the car without a word, giving me space to process what had just happened. As we drove away from Maple Street, I watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror, knowing I would probably never see it again. The finality of that realization hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with grief for the family I'd lost and the home that had been taken from me. We drove to the airport in silence, both of us too stunned to speak. At the terminal, James handled the check-in process while I sat in a plastic chair, staring at the departure board without really seeing it. The photos he'd rescued were in my carry-on bag, a small salvage operation from the wreckage of my past. On the plane, somewhere over Colorado, I finally found my voice. "I keep thinking there must have been signs," I said to James. Some warning that she was planning this. He took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "There's no way you could have known. People don't usually announce when they're planning to destroy someone's belongings." "But the timing," I insisted. "Right after the birthday party, after we had that good conversation, it feels so calculated." "It was calculated," he agreed. "That's what makes it so cruel. She let you hope that things were getting better, then pulled the rug out from under you." I thought about the previous night, how happy she'd seemed during the party, how grateful she'd appeared when talking about the books I'd given her. Had it all been an act? Had she already decided to throw away my belongings while she was smiling and thanking me for my thoughtfulness? The possibility that her warmth had been entirely fabricated was almost worse than her cruelty. At least open hostility was honest. But to fake affection, to let me believe we were healing, only to reveal it as manipulation, that felt like a violation of something fundamental about mother-daughter relationships. "What do I do now?" I asked James. "How do you move forward when your own family treats you like this?" He was quiet for a long time, choosing his words carefully. "I think you grieve," he said finally. "You grieve for the mother you thought you had, for the family you wanted, for the relationship that might have been possible. And then you decide what kind of life you want to build without them." The idea of cutting ties completely with my family felt both terrifying and liberating. For 30 years, I'd structured my life around their expectations and criticisms, even when I was actively rebelling against them. Their approval had been the carrot I could never quite reach, their disappointment, the stick that drove me to achieve more. But what would it look like to live without that constant background noise of judgment? What kind of person could I become if I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I was lacking? The flight attendant came by with drinks, and I ordered wine even though it was barely noon. The alcohol burned slightly going down, but it helped dull the sharp edges of my shock and grief. James squeezed my hand as I stared out the window at the landscape passing below us. "I need to call Marcus," I said suddenly. "I need to hear his side of this." James nodded, though I could see the concern in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that Marcus's absence from the confrontation spoke volumes about where his loyalties lay. But I needed to hear it from him directly, needed to understand how he could stand by while Mom destroyed my belongings and then deliver news about his pregnancy as if nothing had happened. When we landed in San Francisco, I powered on my phone to find 3 missed calls from Marcus and 2 text messages. The first message was sent shortly after we would have discovered the bags. "Heard about the situation this morning. Sorry you had to see that. Can we talk?" The second message, sent an hour later, was more direct. "Mom told me what happened. She's upset, but maybe this is for the best. Some distance might be good for everyone." The casual dismissal of what had happened as a situation made my anger flare fresh. My childhood memories had been thrown away like garbage, my connection to my family home severed without warning, and Marcus was treating it like a minor disagreement that would blow over with time. I called him from the airport terminal, standing near the windows while James retrieved our luggage. He answered on the second ring, his voice carefully neutral. "Sarah, I'm glad you called. I wanted to explain." "Explain what?" I interrupted. Explain how you stood by while Mom threw away 30 years of my life? Explain how you let her ambush me the morning after her birthday party? I didn't know she was planning to do it that way, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely surprised either. She mentioned clearing out your room, but I thought she meant packing things up for you to collect later. Even if that were true, why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you suggest she talk to me first before touching my belongings? There was a long pause before he answered. Because honestly, Sarah, she had a point. You haven't lived here in over 10 years. Some of that stuff was from high school. How long did you expect her to keep it? The casual dismissal of my feelings was so reminiscent of our childhood dynamic that it took my breath away. Marcus had always been the favored child, the one whose needs and perspectives were automatically considered valid. My emotions, my attachments, my sense of loss, these were inconveniences to be managed rather than legitimate responses to be respected. Those weren't just random possessions, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. They were family photos, letters from grandparents, art projects you and I made together as kids. She threw away pieces of your childhood too. I have my own copies of the important stuff, he replied. And honestly, I think you're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be. Mom's been under a lot of stress lately, with Dad's health issues and planning the party. Maybe she just reached a breaking point. This was news to me. Dad's health issues hadn't been mentioned during any of our recent conversations. But even if they were dealing with medical problems, that didn't justify the deliberate cruelty of Mom's actions. What's wrong with Dad? I asked. High blood pressure, some heart palpitations. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to worry Mom. The doctor wants him to reduce stress and change his diet. The information felt like another manipulation, another way to make me feel guilty for not being present during family difficulties. If Dad was having health problems, why hadn't anyone told me? Why was I learning about it only now, as an excuse for Mom's behavior? Marcus, I would have wanted to know about Dad's health. I would have checked in more often, maybe planned additional visits. Would you really? He asked, echoing Mom's earlier challenge. Or would you have worried from a distance and sent a care package? Because that's kind of your pattern, Sarah. You show up for the big moments but miss all the day-to-day stuff. The criticism stung because it contained a grain of truth. I had structured my adult life around independence, around building something separate from my family's influence. I didn't call every week or visit every few months. I didn't insert myself into their daily routines or crises. But that distance hadn't been created in a vacuum. It was a response to years of feeling like nothing I did was good enough, like every interaction with my parents left me feeling smaller and more inadequate. I'd protected myself by limiting contact, but apparently that self-protection was now being used as evidence of my selfishness. I stayed away because being around them hurts, I said quietly. Every conversation with Mom becomes a criticism session. Every visit home reminds me of all the ways I've disappointed them. I built my distance because it was the only way to preserve my sanity. That's your perspective, Marcus said. But from their point of view, it looks like you decided you were too good for us. Like you moved away and forgot where you came from. The fundamental disconnect was becoming clear. In Marcus's mind, and presumably in my parents' minds, my independence was a rejection of them rather than a survival strategy. They couldn't see the years of conditional love, the constant criticism, the impossible standards that had driven me away. All they saw was a daughter who had chosen distance over closeness, success over family. I never thought I was too good for you, I said. I thought I wasn't good enough for you. There is a difference. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but no less resolved. Maybe that's true. But perception is reality, you know? And the reality is that you've been gone for most of my adult life. You missed my engagement party, my wedding was the first time you'd met Linda, and now you're going to miss the birth of my first child, because you live 3,000 miles away. The guilt trip was expertly delivered, hitting all the pressure points my family had trained me to respond to. But something had shifted in me during the confrontation with Mom. The shock of seeing my belongings in garbage bags, the cruelty of her smirk, the calculated nature of her revenge, it had burned away some of the automatic guilt responses I'd carried since childhood. I'm not missing anything by choice. I said. I wasn't invited to your engagement party. I wasn't told about the pregnancy until today, and I found out during a fight where Mom was using it as ammunition against me. You want me to be more involved in family events? Try actually inviting me to them. That's not fair, Marcus protested. We invite you to the big stuff. Christmas, birthdays, holidays. You invite me to obligatory events where I get to sit through lectures about my life choices. You don't invite me to the celebrations, the casual gatherings, the times when families actually enjoy each other's company. The distinction was important, and I could tell it had hit home because Marcus fell silent again. When he resumed talking, there was a defensive edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. Look, Sarah, I called because I wanted to explain what happened and maybe find a way to move forward. But if you're going to turn this into another rehashing of old grievances, I don't think this conversation is productive. The dismissal was so familiar I almost laughed. This was how every difficult conversation with my family ended, with my concerns being labeled as grievances or drama that needed to be set aside for the good of family harmony. But harmony built on suppressing legitimate hurt wasn't really harmony at all. You're right, I said. This conversation isn't productive. Congratulations on the baby, Marcus. I hope you and Linda are happy. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and grief. James appeared beside me with our luggage, taking one look at my face and pulling me into a hug right there in the middle of the airport terminal. How did it go? He asked, though my expression probably answered his question. About as well as you'd expect, I said. He thinks I'm overreacting. Apparently, I should be grateful that Mom only waited 2 years before throwing away my childhood. The drive home from the airport gave me time to process the full scope of what had happened. In the span of 12 hours, I'd gone from believing my family and I might finally be healing to realizing that any relationship we'd had was effectively over. The birthday party had been a performance, the warm conversation with Mom a setup for the devastating reveal the next morning. But as painful as the discovery had been, there was also something clarifying about it. For years, I'd carried guilt about the distance between us, wondering if I was being too sensitive or too stubborn. I'd made excuses for their behavior, telling myself that they loved me in their own way, that their criticism came from a place of caring. Now I could see the situation with painful clarity. This wasn't love expressing itself imperfectly. This was cruelty masquerading as tough love. This wasn't a family struggling to connect across differences. This was a family that had decided one member was expendable. Our apartment felt like a sanctuary. When we finally walked through the door, James immediately began making tea while I sat on our couch, surrounded by the life we'd built together. Everything in this space reflected our choices, our values, our partnership. Nothing here carried the weight of obligation or conditional approval. I need to change my emergency contacts, I said suddenly, the practical implications of the day beginning to sink in. My work forms, my insurance, my medical records, they all list my parents as next of kin. James brought me tea and sat beside me, his presence steady and comforting. We can take care of all that, he said. But you don't have to make every decision tonight. This is a lot to process. He was right, but the practical considerations felt important. If my family could throw away my childhood belongings without warning, what would happen if I was ever incapacitated, and they had to make decisions about my medical care? The thought of my mother having any authority over my life, even in an emergency, was terrifying. I want to call a lawyer tomorrow, I said. I want to make sure they can never make decisions for me if something happens. I want everything legally documented. James nodded, understanding the need to create formal barriers where family bonds had failed. Whatever you need to feel safe and protected. We'll handle it all. That night, I lay awake thinking about the photos James had rescued from the driveway. Most of them were damaged, but a few had survived intact. One showed Marcus and me as children, maybe 8 and 3 years old, building a sandcastle at the beach. We were both grinning at the camera, covered in sand and completely absorbed in our project. Looking at that photo, I grieved not just for my lost belongings but for the relationship Marcus and I might have had if our family dynamics had been different. In another world, He might have been my closest ally, someone who understood the unique pressures of growing up as a Chen child. Instead, he'd become another voice in the chorus of judgment, another person telling me my feelings were invalid. The next few days passed in a blur of practical tasks. I changed my emergency contacts, updated my insurance beneficiaries, and scheduled an appointment with an estate planning attorney to draft documents ensuring my parents would never have legal authority over my life. Each step felt like building a wall between my past and my future, protecting the life I'd built from the family that had rejected it. James took time off work to help me through the immediate aftermath, handling phone calls and paperwork while I processed the emotional impact of what had happened. His steady support reminded me daily that families could be chosen as well as inherited, that love didn't have to come with conditions and criticism. 3 days after we returned from Ohio, I received a package in the mail. The return address was my childhood home, and for a moment my heart leaped with hope that maybe someone had salvaged something from the bags, that perhaps this was an apology or an attempt at reconciliation. Instead, the package contained my birthday gift to Mom, the rare books about Taiwan's history that I'd spent weeks tracking down. There was no note, no explanation, just the books I'd given her thrown back in my face like everything else I'd ever tried to offer. The message was clear. She didn't want anything from me, not my gifts, not my presents, not my attempts at connection. The books that had cost me nearly $500 and countless hours of research were being returned like unwanted merchandise, another way to emphasize how little my efforts meant to her. I sat on my kitchen floor holding those books, finally allowing myself to cry for everything I'd lost. I cried for the mother I'd wanted but never had, for the family relationships that had been poisoned by impossible expectations, for the childhood belongings that were probably already in a landfill somewhere. But most of all, I cried for the dreams I'd held onto for so long, the hope that someday we might understand each other, that love might finally be enough to bridge the distance between us. James found me there an hour later, surrounded by the rejected books and tear-stained tissues. He didn't try to cheer me up or minimize my grief. He just sat beside me on the kitchen floor and held me while I mourned the family I'd finally accepted I would never have. That grief became the catalyst for the most transformative period of my adult life. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into therapy with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a family systems specialist who helped me understand the dynamics that had shaped my relationships for 30 years. Through our sessions, I began to see patterns I'd never recognized before, how my family's conditional love had taught me to seek approval from others, how their criticism had made me hypercritical of myself, how their emotional manipulation had left me doubting my own perceptions. Dr. Vasquez introduced me to the concept of chosen family, the idea that blood relationships weren't automatically sacred or healthy, that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was walk away from toxic people, even if they shared your DNA. The permission to prioritize my own well-being over family loyalty felt revolutionary after decades of being told that family obligations trumped personal happiness. I also began attending a support group for adults estranged from their families. Listening to other people's stories helped me realize how common my experience was. How many successful, loving people had been forced to choose between their sanity and their birth families. There was comfort in the shared understanding, in knowing that my decision to protect myself wasn't selfish or dramatic but necessary and brave. James proved to be an incredible partner through this healing process. He attended therapy sessions when Dr. Vasquez suggested it, helped me research legal protections I might need, and most importantly, never pressured me to reconcile with my family. He understood that sometimes love meant supporting someone's decision to walk away from people who hurt them, even when those people were family. About 6 weeks after the incident, I received an unexpected call from Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother. He'd heard about what happened through family gossip and wanted to reach out. Unlike Marcus's defensive phone call, Uncle Robert's conversation was filled with genuine concern and support. "I always thought your parents were too hard on you," he admitted. "But I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. What your mother did with your belongings. That was cruel, Sarah. There's no excuse for that kind of behavior." His validation meant more than I could express. Uncle Robert had witnessed my childhood, had been present for family gatherings where my parents' treatment of me was on display. His acknowledgement that their behavior was wrong, not my perception of it, helped heal something deep inside me that I hadn't even realized was wounded. "I wish I'd spoken up more when you were younger," he continued. "I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in how your parents raised you, but I can see now that was cowardice on my part. You deserve to have someone advocate for you." That conversation opened the door to a relationship with the extended family that I'd thought was lost forever. Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia began including me in their holiday celebrations, creating space for James and me to experience family gatherings that were actually enjoyable rather than endurance tests. 3 months after the confrontation, I made the decision to start my own family in a different way. James and I had been talking about children for years, but I'd always hesitated, worried about bringing a child into the dysfunction that surrounded my birth family. Now, with clear boundaries established and toxic relationships severed, I felt ready to create the kind of family I'd always wanted. We began trying to conceive, and I started envisioning how different our child's experience would be from mine. They would grow up knowing they were loved unconditionally, that their worth wasn't tied to their achievements, that their feelings and perceptions would always be respected and validated. The contrast between the family I'd grown up in and the one I was creating felt like the ultimate healing. My consulting business also flourished during this period, perhaps because I was no longer carrying the emotional weight of family dysfunction. Without the constant background noise of guilt and criticism, I found myself more creative, more confident in my professional relationships, more willing to take risks that led to exciting new opportunities. I landed a contract with a tech startup that was revolutionizing mental health resources, helping them develop content strategies for reaching people who, like me, were navigating complex family relationships. The work felt deeply meaningful, a way to turn my personal experience into something that could help others facing similar challenges. James's design work was also taking off. He'd been commissioned to create a series of illustrations for a children's book about different family structures: single parents, blended families, chosen families, families headed by grandparents. As I watched him bring these diverse family models to life through his art, I felt grateful that our future children would grow up understanding that families could be created in many different ways, all of them valid. 6 months after that terrible morning in Ohio, I discovered I was pregnant. The joy I felt was pure and uncomplicated, unmarred by anxiety about how my birth family would react or whether they would approve of my parenting choices. This baby would be loved and wanted, raised by parents who had consciously chosen to break cycles of conditional affection and emotional manipulation. I called Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia to share the news, and their excitement reminded me what healthy family responses looked like. They immediately started planning a baby shower, asking about our needs and preferences, rather than imposing their own vision of how things should be done. The contrast with how my mother had hijacked my wedding planning couldn't have been starker. James and I decided not to find out the baby's gender, wanting to focus on preparing emotionally rather than getting caught up in societal expectations about boys versus girls. We spent evenings reading parenting books that emphasized emotional intelligence, respect for children's autonomy, and building secure attachment through consistent, unconditional love. As my pregnancy progressed, I occasionally wondered if my mother knew about the baby, if family gossip had carried the news back to Ohio. Part of me hoped she might reach out, that becoming a grandmother might inspire some kind of reconciliation. But a larger part of me recognized that hoping for her to change was just another form of the emotional dependency I was working so hard to break. When our daughter Elena was born, named after Dr. Vasquez, who had helped me understand what healthy relationships looked like, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced before. Holding her in the hospital room, surrounded by James, Uncle Robert, Aunt Patricia, and chosen family friends who had become like siblings to me, I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like: supportive, celebrating, unconditionally loving. The first months of Elena's life were challenging in all the normal ways, but they were also deeply healing. Every time I responded to her cries with comfort rather than criticism, every time I met her needs without making her feel guilty for having them, I was rewriting the script of what parent-child relationships could be. I was giving her what I'd never received, and, in the process, healing my own wounded inner child. When Elena was 6 months old, I received a card in the mail with an Ohio postmark. For a moment, my heart raced, thinking perhaps my mother had found out about the baby and was reaching out. Instead, the card was from Marcus's wife Linda, announcing the birth of their son David, and including a small photo of the baby. There was no personal note, no invitation to meet my nephew, no acknowledgement of the family rift that meant I was learning about his birth through an impersonal announcement rather than an excited phone call. The formality of it stung, but it also confirmed that I'd made the right choice in prioritizing my own family's emotional health over maintaining toxic connections. I showed the announcement to James, and we talked about whether Elena would ever have the chance to know her cousin. The sadness I felt was real, but different from the desperate grief I'd experienced in the immediate aftermath of the confrontation. This was clean sadness, mourning for what could have been without desperately clinging to false hope for what might still be. As Elena grew from infant to toddler, I watched her develop the kind of secure confidence I'd never had as a child. She explored her world fearlessly, knowing that comfort was always available when she needed it. She expressed her emotions freely, having learned that all feelings were acceptable even if all behaviors weren't. She asked questions without fear of being criticized for not already knowing the answers. The contrast between her childhood and mine was sometimes overwhelming. Watching her play without anxiety, seeing her approach new experiences with curiosity rather than fear of judgment, witnessing her trust that the adults in her life would protect and support her, it all highlighted how different my own early years had been. But rather than making me bitter, these observations filled me with determination. Every day with Elena was an opportunity to continue breaking the cycle, to prove that children could be raised with both love and boundaries, that discipline could happen without emotional manipulation, that parents could guide without controlling. When Elena was 2, James and I decided to buy a house. We found a beautiful craftsman bungalow in a neighborhood filled with young families, with a big backyard where Elena could play and room for the siblings we hoped to give her someday. As we signed the papers and received the keys, I felt the final symbolic separation from my childhood home. This was my real family home, the place where my children would feel safe and loved and valued. The housewarming party we threw was everything I'd wanted family gatherings to be growing up. Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia came, along with our chosen family of close friends who had become Elena's honorary aunts and uncles. There was laughter without underlying tension, conversations without hidden criticisms, celebrations without performance pressure. Dr. Vasquez attended the party, having become more than just my therapist over the years. She was one of the first people to hold Elena, and watching her interact with my daughter reinforced how healthy adult relationships could model security for children. Elena would grow up seeing adults who respected each other, who communicated directly and kindly, who resolved conflicts without resorting to manipulation or cruelty. 3 years after Elena's birth, when she was old enough to ask basic questions about family, I began the delicate process of explaining why she didn't have grandparents on Mommy's side. I told her age-appropriate truths about how sometimes families make choices that hurt each other, how adults sometimes need to protect themselves and their children from people who can't treat them kindly. Elena accepted this explanation with the matter-of-fact adaptability of childhood. To her, family meant the people who showed up consistently with love and support. She had Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia as grandparent figures, James's parents who video called weekly from their retirement community in Florida, and a network of honorary relatives who celebrated her milestones and comforted her struggles. When Elena turned 4, we welcomed her baby brother Michael into our family. The pregnancy and birth were even more joyful than the first time because I'd fully internalized the lesson that families could be created intentionally, with love and wisdom guiding every decision. Michael would grow up in the same environment of unconditional acceptance, with parents who had consciously chosen to break destructive patterns. Around this time, I began writing about my experiences with family estrangement, first in a blog and eventually in a book proposal that caught the attention of a literary agent. The idea of sharing my story publicly felt both terrifying and necessary. I wanted other people in similar situations to know they weren't alone, that choosing your own well-being over family loyalty was not only acceptable, but sometimes essential. The book, when it was finally published 2 years later, was titled Choosing Yourself, A Guide to Surviving Family Estrangement. It combined my personal story with research about toxic family dynamics, and practical advice for people considering distancing themselves from harmful relatives. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of readers reached out to share their own stories, to thank me for giving them permission to prioritize their mental health. Book signings and speaking engagements introduced me to a community I'd never known existed. Successful, loving people who had made the difficult choice to separate from birth families that couldn't treat them with basic respect. Teachers, doctors, artists, parents, grandparents, people from every walk of life who had chosen emotional health over obligation. One particularly powerful speaking event was at a conference for adult children of narcissistic parents. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of people who understood exactly what I'd been through, I felt the final healing of wounds that had shaped my entire life. These were my people, not because we shared DNA, but because we shared the courage to choose ourselves when no one else would. Elena was 6 and Michael was 2 when I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The handwriting was my father's, and my first instinct was to throw it away unopened. But curiosity won out, and I read his brief message expressing regret about how things had ended, and asking if there might be a way to rebuild some kind of relationship. The letter was carefully worded, acknowledging that mistakes had been made without taking full responsibility for the damage that had been done. It was the kind of partial apology I might have accepted in my 20s, desperate for any sign of parental love. But at 35, with my own children to protect and hard-won wisdom about healthy relationships, I could see it for what it was, an attempt to ease his own guilt without doing the real work of change. I showed the letter to James and Dr. Vasquez, both of whom supported whatever decision felt right to me. After much consideration, I wrote back a brief response thanking him for reaching out but explaining that I'd built a life focused on my immediate family and wasn't interested in reopening old wounds. It was kind but firm, loving but boundaried. I never heard from him again, and I felt peace rather than regret about that silence. The daughter who had once desperately craved her father's approval had been replaced by a woman who knew her own worth, who could offer grace without sacrificing her own well-being. Now, as I write this story 8 years after that terrible morning when I found my belongings in garbage bags, I'm surrounded by the life I consciously chose to create. Elena is 10 years old, confident and kind, already showing signs of the emotional intelligence that comes from being raised with respect. Michael is 6, creative and curious, secure in the knowledge that his questions and feelings matter. James and I have been married for over a decade, our relationship stronger for having weathered the storm of family rejection together. Our home is filled with laughter, honest communication, and the kind of unconditional love I once thought was impossible. I still think about my birth family sometimes, wondering if Marcus's children will grow up with the same impossible expectations I did, hoping that perhaps the cycle might be broken in ways I'll never know about. But these thoughts no longer carry the weight of guilt or desperate hope. They're simply acknowledgments of people I once knew, relationships that taught me valuable lessons about what I didn't want in my life. The most profound healing came from realizing that I hadn't lost a family 8 years ago. I'd been freed to create a real one. The family I have now, built on choice and mutual respect and unconditional love, is everything I'd dreamed of as a child, lying in my bedroom listening to criticism and comparison. Sometimes Elena asks if I miss having a bigger family, if I wish she and Michael had more cousins and grandparents. I tell her that families come in all sizes, that love isn't measured by the number of relatives you have but by the quality of relationships you build. She seems satisfied with this answer, secure in the abundance of love that surrounds her daily. The little girl who once stood in her father's kitchen being accused of dramatic attention-seeking has become a woman who trusts her own perceptions completely. The teenager who internalized every criticism has become a mother who celebrates her children's authentic selves. The young adult who desperately sought approval from people incapable of giving it has become someone who offers herself the unconditional love she'd always craved. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It required years of therapy, countless conversations with James, the support of chosen family, and the daily practice of treating myself with the kindness I'd extend to a dear friend. But it was worth every difficult moment, every tear shed in grief for what I'd never had, every challenging decision to prioritize my own well-being. The family that rejected me gave me an unexpected gift. They forced me to learn who I really was beneath all their expectations and criticisms. They taught me through their absence what unconditional love actually looked like. They showed me through their cruelty how to choose kindness in my own relationships. I wouldn't change what happened 8 years ago. As devastating as it was to find my belongings discarded like trash, that moment of clarity freed me from decades of false hope and misplaced loyalty. It allowed me to stop trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it and start building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. Now, when I look at my children playing in our backyard, their laughter filling the air without any undercurrent of anxiety or performance pressure, I know that the cycle has been truly broken. They will grow up knowing they are loved, not for what they achieve but for who they are. They will learn that their feelings are valid, their perceptions trustworthy, their voices worth hearing. And if they ever find themselves in relationships, whether family, friendship, or romantic, that require them to diminish themselves to be accepted, they'll have the strength and self-worth to walk away, because they'll know, from the very core of their being, that they deserve to be loved completely and unconditionally, just as they are. That knowledge, that bone-deep certainty of their own worth, is the greatest gift I could ever give them. It's the gift I had to give to myself, and it's the gift that made building a real family possible. The family that threw me away taught me everything I needed to know about creating one that would never let go. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.